25 years ago, Sinclair Hood addressed a large audience on the subject of palatial Crete in the Greek Chamber of Commerce on the occasion of a series of lectures in celebration of the centenary of our school. He said he would be imitating the magpie, which picks up things here and there as they attract attention, since his subject was so vast. I shall follow suit when discussing the development of the Cnossian Palace, mentioning some of the work carried out over the last 25 years as far as it relates to the palace. Mr. Hood began by concentrating on the evidence for a very early palace at Knossos, a subject that received a boost a year after his lecture when he directed test excavations that sought to answer many of the questions he had actually posed the year before. Not many people get to do that. Apart from detailed work by Don Evely and Vaso Fotu on the throne room, Alan Peatfield confirmed the EM3 date of the neat wall at the northwest corner of the palace that Peter Tompkins just showed you, and found a Middle Minoan 1B entrance through the north wall. Nicoletta Momiglianu debunked the so-called proto-palatial facade slabs in the west court, and Marina Paniotaki and I excavated the area known as Early Magazine A, where a substantial deposit of cups and jugs had been partly excavated in 1973 by Hood and Joe Shaw. The deposit included 3 tiny clay noduli impressed by a seal with an agrimi or wild goat depicted, a hint of administration in a burnt destruction deposit dating to the end of the first phase of the Old Palace period, then mistakenly labelled Middle Minoan 2A, or the 19th century BC. Without going into detail, there was a shaky period in ceramic studies when Evans's Middle Minoan 1B phase was scrapped in Knossos in favour of a larger Middle Minoan 2A phase. This affected a number of otherwise very good publications between 1987 and 1993, when a pottery week at Knossos restored the status quo of stratigraphy and ceramic phasing, reinstating Middle Minoan 1B as a crucial phase for the development of the palace at Knossos in the later 20th century BC, as we shall see. I shall be using the term palace, even though it may not be fashionable in certain quarters, since I agree with Keith Brannigan, who recently wrote of this matter, that sterile and negative debate about finding other terms to describe the monumental buildings of monumental buildings of Knossos, Festos, Malia and Zakros, and other major settlements is ill-directed. It is likely that the earliest palace visible at Knossos is largely of Middle Minoan 2A date, around 1900 BC or a little after, just like that at Festos. Evans used the development of Festos, which was being excavated at about the same time, to fill in gaps at his own site, and I think he was entirely justified in doing so. However, recent work at both Knossos and Festos indicate that their early development was even more closely parallel than even Evans could have thought, although by about 1800 they must have diverged quite substantially since they used different scripts. I apologize that we have to use the ceramic phases devised by Evans and his assistant Duncan Mackenzie, but I shall try and attach rough dates when I can. Keep in mind, for now, the 2 ceramic phases that we call Middle Minoan 1B and 2A, beginning around about 1950 or 1925 BC and continuing towards the end of the 19th century BC. At Festos, Vincenzo La Rosa recently discovered that the original Middle Minoan 1B west facade of the first palace lay beneath the late Minoan 1 or 16th century Ashlar facade of the second palace, several meters east of the west facade that we have always associated with the old or first palace at that site, which belongs to Middle Minoan 2A. I hope that's clear from this slide. So at Festos, they started small, expanded for the Middle Minoan 2 period, and then contracted again for Near-Palatial, returning to the original western border. At Knossos, it is quite clear that the present west facade postdates the very earliest phase of the palace, since one of the raised walkways runs straight underneath the orthostat facade at West Magazine 2. Clearly, this was a major entrance to the palace at some early stage, and I think it may even have been a traditional route giving access to the open areas of the hill from a much earlier date. Middle Minoan 1B pottery, million obsidian blades and a core, and clay nodules hinting at administration at the west end of Magazine 2 give a terminus postquem for the construction of the facade at this point, probably making it contemporary with the Middle Minoan 2A Festos facade. At the north end of this same west facade, a little architectural stratigraphy gives us a glimpse at the original Middle Minoan 1B facade beneath the orthostats. Here you can see at the bottom the late 3rd millennium or early Minoan 3 wall with decaying gypsum blocks above belonging to a later phase. The limestone base of the later gypsum orthostats lies on top of this. To me, this is the clearest evidence that the limited EM3 building, which could have been a proto-palace of sorts, and the much expanded Middle Minoan 1B building, or early First Palace, were followed by the Middle Minoan 2A structure along the same western lines, which we can think of as the consolidation of the First Palace. It is possible that the present orthostats were reused from the original Middle Minoan 1B facade, making them broadly contemporary with the Middle Minoan 1A, with the Middle Minoan 1 orthostats at Malia Chrysolakos. I will not here go into the probable origin of orthostatic masonry in northern Syria. In 1987, when excavating the rest of Sinclair Hood's Middle Minoan 1B burnt destruction deposit in early Magazine A, we were fortunate to expose much of a massive wall of limestone and gypsum dress blocks bearing the two earliest datable masons' marks at Knossos. The wall you can see just to the right of where it says MM1B. The mason marks were two stemless double axes, visible with the eye of faith, on the south-facing blocks that also showed distinct chiselling marks. Mason's marks broadly coincide with the occurrence of Cretan hieroglyphic on seals and seal impressions, although the mason's marks are not writing as such and appear uniquely Cretan in origin. Sinclair Hood, with a little help from Jan Driesen and me, has catalogued every visible mark from Knossos, an important venture since their development from large, deeply cut to small, barely visible signs are sometimes the only evidence we have for the chronology of the palace walls. The early Magazine A deposit of almost 300 cups, jugs and bowls, because of its distinct ceramic hierarchy, may indicate a hierarchical structure to a ceremony or feast in which they were used. This slide illustrates how the hierarchy could work if each person was given a specific footed goblet depending on their rank, however that was decided. The master of ceremonies would be given the finest polychrome goblet. However, we have little idea how early palatial Knossos might have been organized, although there may be some indications in hieroglyphic formulae on seals for the existence of office and institution, as Judith Weingarten has argued. Later, when wall paintings might be expected to depict a leader, whether royal or religious, there are no signs of any inclination to do so. This will reflect the system in place rather than any modesty on the part of a ruler. Returning to seals and their impressions, it is significant that of all the known Middle Minoan 1B deposits in and around the palace, more have produced seal impressions than have not. Recently, when studying a Middle Minoan 1B deposit from the southwest houses, this peg or pommel ceiling jumped out from among the sherds on the strewing tables. It's of a type known from Egypt, and it seems possible that some aspects of sealing practices were learnt from there in the absence of many suitable candidates of the 20th century BC in the Near East or Anatolia. Whether the Middle Minoan 1B palace continued south from the early Magazine A facade in terrace stages down the hill, we do not know. The present southern border only has the limestone base for what would have been gypsum blocks or orthostats of Middle Minoan 2A or the 19th century, adjacent to an early pebbled court laid down at this time. Immediately behind this line is a row of the orthostats of the kind of orthostats I'm talking about. Remaining on the west side of the palace, another Middle Minoan 1B deposit is of great interest, namely the Vat Room Deposit located in the later Central Palace Sanctuary, just next to the temple repositories, where the Middle Minoan 3B faience snake goddess and her votaries, so-called, were found. The Vat Room Deposit appears to have been material cleared and placed in a pit in advance of reorganization of the area, probably after a burnt destruction. The character of the material strongly indicates the storage of cult paraphernalia in an administered area, although the objects, including faience, obsidian, shell, stone vases, pottery, and a few clay ceilings, were broken and burnt when deposited. The deposit implies that the later Central Palace Sanctuary was a cult area from the very beginning of the palace in Middle Minoan 1B, and possibly earlier, since some of the pottery seems to be MM1A in date, or even earlier. Nearby were the truncated proto-palatial magazines with massive door jambs carved with a deeply cut mason's mark, the croix pommée or pâté, as it's called, appropriate for this period. Apart from the common characteristics of a monumental building around a central court with a west court and theatral area, Phaistos and Knossos shared large-scale storage facilities in circular stone-lined pits called the couloures. At Knossos, one in the theatral area dated to MM1B and 3 more in the west court, probably MM2A in date. There have been discussions as to whether these were palace-controlled storage pits or somehow more public. They were certainly more public than internal storage in the West magazines. However, I suspect they were used mainly at harvest time, when sheaths of wheat could be stored in the couloures for some time before threshing. The threshing could then take place within the context of a harvest festival, either in the West Court or the Central Court, under the aegis of the palace, which would then store a portion of the threshed grain in the West magazines, along with other products such as olive oil, wine, and even valuable goods. The Middle Minoan 1B palace probably covered a large part of the Kafala hill, and palatial control may be measured by the extent of the hieroglyphic seal impressions. On the east slope, the monumental MM1A cult building, the monolithic pillar basement seen here, produced hieroglyphic seals in its Middle Minoan 1B phase. Beneath a Middle Minoan 3A fill in the room of the olive press or drain heads on the east slope, a Middle Minoan 1B deposit produced yet more seal impressions. All Middle Minoan 1B to 2 structures outside the strict palace boundaries on the east slope should have been dependent on the palace and were in any case enclosed by massive terrace walls that you see here that skirted the lower slope of the hill at this time. By placing the existing orthostats of the west facade in Middle Minoan 2A, or the 19th century BC, we bring with them the construction of the west magazines, with their massive door jamb piers, with fairly large mason's marks typical of the old palace period. The long corridor that ran north-south in front of all the magazines also belongs here. There are specific groups of mason's marks in the west wing, indicating that from the very beginning, groups of magazines on the west served specific rooms on the east of the long corridor. Thus, concentrations of double axes in the southern magazines, notably on the orthostats, are mirrored by double axes in the area of the Central Palace Sanctuary, notably on all faces of the square gypsum pillars in the later east and west pillar crypts. Even if the pillars are later than MM2, they will represent a continuation of the link with the adjacent magazines begun at least by MM2A. The gate sign, uniquely Knossian, and not one, I think, that is carved after Middle Minoan 2, is frequent in the throne room complex and the magazines opposite. The deeply carved gate left visible by Evans in the lustral basin of the throne room, of which you can only see half here. I'm sorry, it's off the picture slightly, but you can get the idea. Could well indicate that this sunken cult place, such a unique leitmotif of Minoan architecture, goes right back to Middle Minoan 2A at least, an idea generally supported on other grounds by observations of Sieglinde Mirier and of Wolf Dietrich Niemeyer. I imagine that whatever was stored in the magazines opposite the throne room complex was used in the activities relating to the throne room and lustral basin, and possibly beyond to the central court. On the other side of the palace, some parts of the domestic quarter had been built by Middle Minoan II, perhaps even including a predecessor of the grand staircase. And certainly the magnificent drainage system underneath the quarter. This great cutting, 8 meters deep into the Neolithic mound, allowed a 3-story building to be constructed which reached the level of the central court, but did not impede the view of the buildings on the west side of the court. Jan Driesen and I found numerous masons' marks inside the drains underneath this quarter when we crawled through them and planned them in the mid-1980s. Middle Minoan II deeply cut marks occurring on original parts of the drain and other detailed architectural observations allowed us to place it in the second phase of the proto-palatial period, namely Middle Minoan IIA, or a little after 1900 BC. This was a great feat of planning and construction, and clearly predates the main MM3B layout of the domestic quarter, since it does not serve each part of the complex as comfortably as it might had it been originally planned with the MM3 ground plan in mind. So by the 19th century, the whole area of the later palace was already occupied by the so-called Old or First Palace. This central building had long been approached by public roads, notably the Royal Road from the town to the west and the viaduct and step portico from the south. The palace suffered 2, if not 3, destructions between its official inception in Middle Minoan 1B and about 1750 or 1700 BC, those leaving the most evidence belonging to about 1900 and 1800 respectively. There is little time to illustrate the material culture of these centuries, but it was the period of the finest eggshell Camara's Polychrome Pottery, best illustrated by examples from the so-called royal pottery stores to the northeast, perhaps outside the palace, but probably dependent on it, like the MM1B to 2A houses southwest of the palace. Excuse me. These are the southwest houses. Here, underneath the southwest house, we excavated a deposit of pottery, horn cores, and soapstone seal-making debris in 1992. With the deposit was a fragment of a clay tablet, burnt black, recording at least 60 units of some commodity. Unfortunately, the numeric system for tens is identical in Linear A and hieroglyphic, although given the site at which it was found and the accompanying clay nodulus with a hieroglyphic hand or glove against an interlaced background, I would bet on it being the earliest hieroglyphic tablet in Crete. I think that the proximity of such a modest structure to the palace, combined with the evidence for limited administration, indicate that the workshops here were dependent on the palace and producing for it. It was not until the Southwest House proper and other elite mansions of the New Palace period were built in MM3B that we see the rise of powerful, independent households at Knossos, as Evans suggested. The hieroglyphic deposit or archive of the palace is a little later than our horncore deposit. There are problems with its date and the unity of this archive, yet for our purposes we can assume that many of the inscribed clay tablets, bars, medallions and ceilings did indeed come from a single deposit in the long corridor located in a space on the north side of the stairs leading to the upper story, just opposite magazine 17. This will have been an archive that was baked in a destruction by fire and then swept up when alterations were made in the succeeding period. As Evans himself said, while hieroglyphic seals could have had a religious meaning, these clay documents represented business, probably the business of storage in the West magazines. The location implies that the north end of the long corridor was an important access point for the magazines. The date of the hieroglyphic deposit is uncertain, although it probably represented the end of the Old Palace period at Knossos. Traditionally, the Old Palace period ends around 1750 or 1700 BC in Middle Minoan 2b, with widespread destructions throughout much of Crete. At Knossos, the problem is more difficult since we do not have great deposits of destruction debris dating to Middle Minoan 2b as they do at Festos. Can we assume an absolutely parallel history? Probably not. Sandy McGillivray has simply suggested that the destruction takes place a little later at Knossos, when Middle Minoan 3a pottery was in fashion, resulting in large mixed deposits of MM2b and 3a styles in the couloirs of the West Court, which were filled in then and probably paved over, enlarging the court substantially. If there was a general destruction of the palace in Middle Minoan 2b, then the only existing evidence of it seems to be the loom-weight basement of the east slope, with its great deposit of melon-shaped loom weights for specialized Knossian weaving that was to continue through to late Minoan II and the later 15th century at least. Some have expressed doubts as to the date of the deposit due to the discovery of a polychrome amphora decorated with palms and relief double axes at the base of the handle. Whatever the truth, this deposit is followed by massive fills of Middle Minoan 3a or 17th century BC pottery that raised the terracing of the east slope to create a large hall called by Evans the East Hall, which was eventually decorated with high-relief wall paintings. You can see this dashed red line at the top, ending in the lower level where it says floor level in late Middle Minoan 3a tripod pot level. It would be at that point and everything to the left, which would be covered by this East Hall. It is clear that Middle Minoan 3a was a period of major architectural change on the Kefala Hill, and one that is associated with the first pictorial paintings, since from this fill came parts of a relief bull fresco, the start of a series of reliefs that carried on into the late Bronze Age, culminating in late Minoan 1 with the well-known Prince of the Lily Crown, perhaps rather a young man, royal, priestly or divine, leading a sphinx. The raging bull, now reconstructed above the massive bastions of the north entrance passage, may have been fairly early in date, Middle Minoan 3, although the bastions on which the reproduction now stands may not have had anything to do with it, as they are of a slightly later date. Relief wall paintings do not carry on after late Minoan 1b or about the middle of the 15th century. Wall paintings were generally an important feature of much of the palace after 1700 BC, whether monumental, like the bulls, or miniature, like the later Sacred Grove and Dance, and the temple frescoes that you see here, from a room to the northwest of the central court. They appear to illustrate parts of the palace, perhaps in the case of the temple fresco, the central court, with a great crowd watching a ceremony or a sporting event like bull leaping. Architectural embellishments in gypsum probably begin in Middle Minoan 3a, but are most prominent from Middle Minoan 3b, or about 1650 onwards. The remodelling of the domestic quarter, with its lavish use of gypsum, could be as early as Middle Minoan 3a. The various rooms of the ground floor seem to me to represent a complex ceremony involving preparation of a woman, perhaps a priestess, follow the blue line here, in rooms such as the Toilette and Queen's Megaron, for presentation in the great public reception room, the Hall of the Double Axes, so called after the double-axe mason's marks carved on the fine limestone ashlar of its western light well. The gypsum architectural embellishments here are the finest in Crete. They include huge gypsum dados or veneering of the kind found throughout the domestic quarter and in lustral basins, and gypsum pier and door partitions that become marks of elite architecture throughout Crete in the New Palace period. In addition, the room arrangement demonstrates the efficacy of the Minoan light well on three sides, which is, I think, very well illustrated by this slide. The other notable feature of Cnossian Middle Minoan III is limestone ashlar masonry. The finest blocks, some with very lightly cut mason's marks, belong to the latest palatial phase, LM1. However, there are a number of walls of Middle Minoan III or 17th century BC date with well-cut mason's marks of medium size, like the Hall of the Colonnades here, the bastions of the North Entrance Passage, and the Court of the Stone Spout. Detailed investigation by Don Evely and Vaso Fotu in the complex of rooms around the throne room revealed three broad phases, with red plaster floors in phase 1 of Middle Minoan II date, gypsum floors in Middle Minoan III in the second phase through to LM1, and white plaster floors in phase 3 of late Minoan II to III date. The gypsum floors of the throne room and antechamber remained in use until the final destruction of the palace. The throne itself should belong to the second phase of Middle Minoan III and may have preceded the installation of gypsum benches, perhaps in late Minoan 1b or late Minoan II, when wingless griffins and palm trees were painted on either side of the throne, not the papyrus that you see here in the reconstruction. Wolf Dietrich Niemeyer, building on the work of Mireille and Helga Reusch, suggested that the griffins were related to an enacted epiphany of the goddess. The relatively late date of the griffins, which remained on the walls of the throne room until the final destruction, suggests that any hypothetical enacted epiphany through the service room door replaced whatever rituals had previously been enacted in the lustral basin, which was probably filled in sometime in late Minoan I. The throne room with benches looks more like a council chamber than a cult room, and I wonder whether the griffins are merely there to enhance the authority of the person sitting in the throne, whether priestly or royal. If this is the case, the installation of the benches in LM1b or LM2 would be indicative of a very important change in the function of the most prominent public room on the ground floor of the palace sometime in the 15th century BC. When the central palace sanctuary was first remodelled in Middle Minoan III, most of the rooms were spacious squares like the temple repositories and room of the tall pithos combined that you see here, bordered on the east by the gypsum orthostat facade of the Old Palace period. This room communicated directly with a room of three stone-lined cists to the north, which in turn had access to the throne room complex to the north of that. There was also easy access through the pillar crypt to the group of west magazines with double-axe mason's marks. This appears to be a moment in the history of this area when everything was working together, and all of it facing the central court where the larger ceremonies would take place. The contents of the temple repositories are for many the highlight of a visit to Heraklion Archaeological Museum, even if in its present temporary form. Marina Paniotaki has published their contents in admirable detail. Apart from the files goddess and votaries, so-called, there are exquisite files plaques like this with a wild female goat suckling her offspring. There are seashells, gold, bronze, rock crystal, bone, ivory, stone and clay vessels. One of the only 3 Cnossian Linear A tablets also came from here, along with almost 100 clay ceilings, noduli, roundels, flat-based nodules, and 1 or 2 direct object ceilings. The ceiling experts are loath to allow this deposit to belong entirely to the Middle Bronze Age, but I am inclined to agree with Evans and Mackenzie and to place the latest datable material in Middle Minoan 3b. Some of the vases are even earlier in date, and there are several Middle Cycladic III imports. The temple repository objects themselves are unlikely to have been stored in the stone cists, but close by, ready to be used in cult ceremonies, perhaps on specific days of the year, and perhaps in the central court, the room of the colonnades, or even the throne room. The cists in which they were found, combined with the three to the north, also filled in at the end of the Middle Mynoan 3B period, provided a great deal of space for storage, perhaps of foodstuffs and liquids. The combined storage capacity of the 5 cists will have approached 15,000 litres. Cists are an important feature of Middle Mynoan III in several parts of the palace, not least the west magazines. But here they were combined with tall, slender pithoi of the near-palatial period. Kostas Christakis has calculated that very roughly 8% of the area of the late Mynoan I palace may have been given over to storage. The kouloures were by now closed and out of the picture, so there was no intermediary storage between town and palace. It was either in or out, and thus more exclusive. The 1992 to 1993 excavations in the area of the southwest houses showed that the transformation from modest dwellings or workshops on narrow terraces to large elite mansions was a gradual one, with apparently an intermediate stage and size of building belonging to Middle Mynoan 3A that you see here. By Middle Mynoan 3B to Late Mynoan I, the southwest house covered 2 large terraces and an area only surpassed by the little palace. Most of the contents of the house had disappeared after late reoccupation of the area and the construction of an early classical cobbled road. However, the quality of the architecture, including a monolithic pillar basement, an L-shaped or peristyle light well, and a fine stepped facade with covered drain, demonstrates that this was an exceptional building, at least on a par with others that surrounded the palace, like the south and southeast houses. Evans describes the southwest house as an actual invasion of the palace site by private persons. These independent mansions will have been powerful households with strong influence on the palace, with a degree of autonomy, not least economic. High officials may have been drawn from these families. Another private residence existed to the west of the southwest house, but it had largely been destroyed in Late Mynoan 1B. In its place, a new house with gypsum pier and door partition was built in Late Mynoan 2, though it too was then badly damaged by fire in the same period, before the end of the 15th century BC. Reoccupation, particularly in Late Mynoan 3B, was at a higher level, with doorways blocked and all semblance of elite architecture lost. Evans thought that all these houses had gone out of use at the end of Late Mynoan 1A, or in the 16th century BC, but our excavations showed that elite architecture continued at least until the end of Late Mynoan 2. By the 14th century, however, standards had dropped, and it is unlikely that the households here were particularly active either within the palace or as independents. Something essential had changed, so that by the time of the LM3A1 destruction of, say, the royal villa, only one of the independent mansions could have played an influential role in the palace or the town, namely the so-called Little Palace to the west. Returning to the area of the southwest houses, the walls of the Late Mynoan 2 house were built of whatever masonry could be found from previously destroyed buildings, including much reused gypsum. This is very much a feature of the partition walls of the west magazines of the palace, which had surely been entirely rebuilt after a Late Mynoan 1 destruction. There is probably slightly more evidence for destruction in the palace in Late Mynoan 1B than I allowed for when giving a paper in Louvain-la-Neuve 9 years ago. I had divided the palace up into 3 architectural phases, the new palace that is, which I dubbed the New Palace, the Frescoed Palace, and for Late Mynoan 1B, the Ruined Palace. I now realize that it was a rather naive and narrow view of the development of the New Palace, largely due to a lack of understanding of the importance of Middle Minoan 3A, when many developments took place throughout Crete and pictorial fresco painting really started. In addition, my literal reading of the absence of late Minoan 1B deposits in the palace was probably extreme. I'm prepared to accept that this may be an illusion created by the clearing up of destruction debris and the cleaning up of gypsum floors so that life could continue. Eleni Hatsaki has noted how the neopalatial gypsum floors of the royal villa were swept clean so that they could be reused in late Minoan 3A, or the early 14th century BC. And this must have been true also of much of the palace, as here in the Hall of the Double Axes. Yanis and Efi Sakilarakis at Archanis have made a strong case for north-central Crete being hit by a strong earthquake at this time. Indeed, the late Minoan 1B destructions of Crete may well have been a combination of earthquake and human agency, perhaps due to internal strife, like that which plagued Hellenistic Crete so much, in our case exacerbated by hardship in the aftermath of the eruption of Thera, whose potential effects have been detailed by Jan Driessen and myself in a book called The Troubled Island. I have not mentioned this cataclysmic event so far because no direct effects of the eruption can be traced at Knossos. Certainly no tsunami could have affected a site 100 meters above sea level. However, since Knossos is supposed by some to have come under mainland Mycenaean Greek control after 1450 BC, it is worth just saying a few words about the aftermath of the eruption and the causes of late Minoan 1B destructions. I certainly see the merits of both Minoan continuity and the arrival of some Mycenaean groups at Knossos and at Hania. Thera was very much used by Minoan Crete and Knossos in particular as a friendly maritime forward base in the South Aegean. This had begun suddenly and intensely in Middle Minoan 3A, well over 100 years before the eruption. Linear A tablets and clay ceilings at Akrotiri imply that the language of commerce was probably that of Crete, although mainland Greek will also have been understood. With the removal of Thera as an important link in the networks of the South Aegean, as detailed by Carl Knappert and his colleagues recently, it is clear from the archaeological record of sites like Philakopie on Milos that Cretan activity falls off at the expense of the Mycenaean mainland. This is largely based on pottery imports. Now, John Bennett has made the very interesting suggestion that by late Minoan 1B, certain groups at Knossos would have been bilingual in the Cretan language and Mycenaean Greek. Taking this a stage further, the increase in mainland activity on islands in late Cycladic II, that's the equivalent of late Minoan 1B, will have allowed Mycenaean Greek to become the lingua franca of the Aegean. As such, by the time of late Minoan II at Knossos, it would have been very sensible for Mycenaean Greek to have been adopted as the language of economic activity, that is, the language of the later Linear B tablets. I might add that perhaps the single most important development in prehistory during the second half of the 20th century AD in the Aegean was the decipherment of Linear B as Mycenaean Greek by Michael Ventris. This scenario for the transformation of Linear A into Linear B does not require an invasion of mainland Greeks, taking over Knossos and causing the destructions of late Minoan 1B Crete. However, this does not explain the startling changes in burial customs and cemetery locations at Knossos and Hania. Maria Vlazaki and her colleagues have excavated the Zaffa Papura of West Crete in the southeast of Hania since 2003. Both Hania and at Knossos, these cemeteries of chamber tombs, shaft graves and pit graves are quite different from anything that has gone before, even admitting that the number of graves of the late Minoan 1 period are few and far between. What intrigues me is that while one might argue that the tombs represent emulation in Crete of elite burial practices in, for example, the Argolid, this cannot explain how the shaft grave comes to be used in late Minoan II, half a century after the last one had been dug in the Argolid. The conclusion reached by Maria Vlazaki for Hanya is probably also the conclusion to be reached for Knossos, namely that some mainland families or groups of elite warrior status came to Crete immediately after the late Mycenaean 1b destructions. This neither requires an invasion nor does it necessitate calling the ensuing period Mycenaean. At any rate, I have no problems in seeing a Cretan administration writing Mycenaean Greek from the end of the 15th century at Knossos. Many parts of the palace continued as before with similar functions. The West magazines accepted new pithoi probably as late as late Mycenaean 3a2 or the 14th century BC. On the left you see an example of a late Mycenaean 3a pithos, possibly 3a2. That's in the south propylaeum, and here in the long corridor, a restored pithoi, a recently restored pithoi. The rooms and halls above the magazines and in parts of the domestic quarter were used by scribes by the time of the final destruction of the palace, detracting from any sense of palatial grandeur. The central palace sanctuary may have continued as the most sacred part of the palace, perhaps with the continued use of the late Mycenaean 1 cult stone vessels, unless this was really a late Mycenaean 1b destruction deposit, as Hood has suggested. The palace-style jars of the later 15th century and early 14th century were no longer in use by the time of the final destruction. As I suggested earlier, the throne room of late Mycenaean II with benches round the walls had taken on the look of a council chamber, the occupant of the throne perhaps being the current leader or the Warnax of the Linear B tablets. Rituals of sorts continued on the evidence of the stone alabaster found on the floor. The frescoes of the palace still avoided portraying the Knossian leadership in direct contrast to Pharaonic Egypt. These are the alabaster from the throne room at the top. The Procession Fresco, which may date as late as late Mycenaean II, will have been on the walls of the procession corridor leading round to the south propylaeum at the time of the final destruction. It was a religious procession of life-size figures bearing gifts and walking in the direction of a large-scale female figure, perhaps a goddess or priestess, as a goddess. The final destruction, which baked the clay tablets and ceilings, happened either in the 14th century or the earlier 13th. We have come a long way since the polarization of the 1960s with the John Boardman and Leonard Palmer debate. We now discuss whether the final destruction belongs to late Mycenaean 3a2 or early late Mycenaean 3b. I have nothing new to offer in this matter, and the complex evidence has been well rehearsed by Popham, Warren, Hood, Wiener, Halliger, Niemeyer. The list goes on. However, we may never be certain of the answer and may have to deal with probabilities. Mervyn Popham, who was my tutor at Oxford and thesis supervisor, was a great fan of looking at developments outside the palace to see if they reflected what went on inside the palace. The cemeteries, for example, to see where the historical line might best be drawn. Eleni Hatsaki's work on the late Mycenaean III temple tomb and the Zafar-Papura cemetery indicates that the rich burials in the latter end in late Mycenaean 3a2, and use of the temple tomb ends in the same period. This might also be indicative of the end of the palace, of the palatial palace administration. Yet the discovery in Hanya of Linear B tablets in the Knossian tradition may indicate that there should not be a huge difference in time between them. And this is one reason why I tend towards a late 14th century date for the Knossian tablets, 50 years or so before the Hanya tablets, a date championed at one point by Malcolm Wiener and Sinclair Hood. The evidence from Hanya may indicate that the palatial torch had been passed to or had been taken by Hanya in late Mycenaean 3a2, leaving Knossos with the memory of its past, while continuing to function as an urban centre with some occupation of the palace, perhaps connected with cult, as demonstrated by the Shrine of the Double Axes southeast of the central court. The palace may have begun as a sacred centre and ended as a complex administrative centre where religion had begun to take a back seat, However, the aftermath of its destruction may be seen as a return to its sacred roots. Thanks very much.